Nomiki Show. We clash momentarily for class solidarity. Cash circulating, give the masses back its currency. Greed from elites, oligarchs stay fed. Deep state, fake fed, everybody break bread. Racism, homophobia, sexism, religion in this melting pot we live in. Time to build a new system, unionize labor rights. Highlight the issue, talking heads left is best. The saga continues. The Nomiki Show.
Hello and welcome to the Nomiki Show. It is Friday, March 11th. It's Femme Friday. We have a very special show today. Our first Friday back from my vacation in Cuba. Very exciting show today. We're going to be talking about everything from the trucker convoys in Canada, what happened, how it even took place, how it grew, who was behind it, whether or not they are still in operation, and obviously what that means for the global impact of it, since they have had copycats all over the world. Later, we're going to be talking to Alleen Brown. Alleen Brown is going to talk about the climate justice movement, but specifically how climate change is impacting incarcerated communities, different facilities around the country, which are being impacted by climate change, from floods, hurricanes, to fires, to heat, to worsening conditions because of the structures that just weren't set up for these types of events, and how that's impacting the incarcerated people and what we can do about it. She's got some great reporting out in the Intercept right now. And then later, this is a fascinating one. We're going to be discussing the war on teachers and how the right wing has been coordinating and funding this movement for years to go after school boards and what it's really about. We're going to be talking with Commissioner Allison Collins. She's a former Board of Education Commissioner, for the San Francisco Unified School District. They have done an incredible report on this. Your jaw might drop because, like I said, it was never about just teachers. It's always about how to weaponize against a very powerful union that funds the Democratic Party. And really that has been a project of the Koch brothers and the far right for quite a bit of time. All right, everybody, we have a great show. We'll be right back after this quick break. You're watching The Nomiki Show. All right, guys, we have some breaking news in. By the time you see this, I'm sure we'll know more information. We are pre-taping a little bit early today. Out of Texas, the Supreme Court rules against abortion providers, closing last backdoor to block 6-week ban that is out of the Texas Supreme Court on Friday. That's today. They dealt a final blow to a legal challenge, per USA Today, of the nation's most restrictive abortion law. Let's reiterate that. This is the nation's most restrictive abortion law. The Texas Supreme Court said licensing officials, I'm quoting USA Today, are not responsible for enforcing the state's near total ban on abortion, effectively ending the challenge brought by abortion providers across the state. This is again from USA Today. Attorney for Center for Reproductive Rights, Mark Huron, says there is nothing left. This case is effectively over. And with respect to our challenge to the abortion ban, this comes a day after Missouri had passed a law banning abortions that are related to ectopic pregnancies. I shared a story on Instagram and Twitter in which I remember I have this probably one of my earliest memories was being a toddler sitting next to my mother's bed with an ice cream cone with sprinkles on it, because of course that's how your brain remembers things when you're that age. And she was in the hospital because she was not feeling well, pregnant, getting ready to board a flight. And my dad instinctively decided that he was going to take my mom to the hospital. And turns out, she had complications. She had an ectopic pregnancy. And if she had boarded that flight or waited, the doctor said, she would have died. So it's very serious. This is extremely serious. And there's not ectopic pregnancies are not like a choice. It's you're killing the mother if you're banning it. That's what you're doing. This is an assault against women, an erasure of women. This is cruel. This is a human rights violation. I don't think we need to say this enough. And I think we have to discuss this more and more and more on these leftist shows. And I'm asking all of the male allies here to do so on our behalf as women, because it's really going to take a true act of solidarity to recognize that this is about erasing women. This is about erasing women's rights. This is about reinforcing gender roles that are aggressively demonistic, and it's beyond misogynistic. This is about making sure that there is an elite group of white men who control everything, and that we are not teaching next generations of men to have respect for women by not seeing them in office, by not having rights, by not being able to have autonomy over your own body. Yeah, I'll leave it at that. On that note, please, if you're not already, please make sure to support us on patreon.com/The Nomiki Show. That is how we fund the show. Make sure to like and subscribe. We got to get those likes and subscribes up. There's been a real attack on left media, as I'm sure you're seeing. Everybody's being hit hard right now. Everybody who's not supported by bots is being hit hard right now. Everybody who's not being supported by disinformation campaigns is being hit hard right now and isn't corporately funded. So please, if you can, and if you haven't already, and you're capable of becoming a patron or upping your patron, oh my God, that would help pay for another patron who maybe we lost along the way because of the economy. If you are a patron or have been and want to join again, let us know. We will work something out with you. Those are just the numbers that are on the screen, but we're happy to work out different patron levels, cover, on, off for a few months, whatever it is, we will help you, because to me, this is a project that we've worked really hard on, and we've put a lot of thought and effort on what it means to do this show and to be in solidarity with other hosts and what kind of guests we have on. But we're only able to do that because we have patrons. And so please, if you can, come and support us and share our show on all the social media. We want to start doing clips again on social. I think that helps, but it's really about getting the information out there. And guests like like Allison, for instance, she's on the show. She's going to be talking about the attacks on teachers' unions and what that means for democracy and who's really behind it. You're not really seeing that anywhere else, as you'll see in the show today. But thank you to everybody who already is a patron. We love you. We so love you. And we're looking forward to doing some special stuff with you very soon. All right, we'll be right back after this break. Welcome back to the Nomiki Show. All right, our next guest is going to give us the update on what was the biggest story until Ukraine. And it seemed like that was the invasion that was coming. I'm not trying to be flippant about this. I think it was a very serious concern that the far right was putting money into, of course, the trucker convoy. Professor Nomi Claire Lazar is a professor in the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Ottawa, where she is also an elected member of the governing board. She is quite an expert on these convoys and the state of emergency that Canada was sent into with the convoys. Thank you so much for joining us, Professor.
Thank you so much for the invitation. Much appreciated.
So, do the convoys still exist? Is it still taking place? Because the media seems to have forgotten about them.
Well, certainly there are still protesters in Ottawa. My daughter and I finally ventured downtown over the weekend, and there's still plenty of people around flying upside down Canadian flags and saying rude, nasty things about Trudeau. And just yesterday, I saw a truck parked with the signature flags as well. So certainly there are protesters still around, but that, of course, is their democratic right. At this point, the protesters are behaving as we expect protesters to behave. They're not committing any offense or disrupting the lives of Ottawa citizens, but they're certainly still around.
So let's just work backwards on when they started to show up at the Capitol. Was there a sense that they were going to do this, or did it just pop up overnight?
Well, we had, as far as I understand, quite a bit of advance notice that they were on their way. And so far, we, the public, don't have that much information as to why the police were not adequately prepared. Is it the case that they simply didn't know what the protesters were planning? There have been suggestions that they did know. But the police have said, or certainly were saying at the time, that they didn't expect this kind of thing. So they knew that there were people coming and planning to protest, but they didn't expect that this occupation style of protest. And the issue really was not so much that the protesters were here, but that they had basically entrenched themselves in such a way that the streets could not, physically could not be cleared. So certainly there were huge failures on the part of the police. It is heartening that there was accountability almost immediately, so that the chief of police resigned. So did the head of the police board, who was not adequately. The board is supposed to be supervising the police, and they were not adequately exercising their power in terms of making sure that the police were doing what they ought to. So the board chair has also resigned. And we do have a process of accountability underway as well with respect to police, members of the police force who seem to have been actively supporting the convoy financially and otherwise.
Interesting.
So the good news is accountability. That's what we want to see.
So the police chief resigned and the member of the board, and this was because they did not put preventative measures in place. And that seems that actually, I mean, that would never happen in the United States. Let's be real, but that seems almost. That's very aggressive. Was there anything else? Like, were they linked financially, those people in particular?
No, not so. There have been 2 or 3 members of the police, of the Ottawa Police, who have been linked financially. They're just regular members of the police, and they are being held to account now. They're being investigated now. But the resignations were less over a lack of preparedness than a lack of action afterward. So the citizens of Ottawa were very disturbed. We're quite I'm sure you Americans, think of us Canadians as boring. And if you could think of the most boring
nice. We think of you as nice.
then Ottawa is it's a very, very nerdy city. So it's tech and policy, basically. So it's just wonks all the way through. And we're quite a law-abiding group of folk, and our city's 94% vaccinated, et cetera. So, but we're used to protests, right? It's not as that it is still the capital city, but we were not used to. I can't think of another situation in which we had ever seen a protest quite like this, where the public were the target. And so that, I think, was very shocking to people, and the police seemed not to be doing anything. And again, we don't know what the background is there. The chief of police kept saying, we're trying to avoid provoking violence, which is, if they had just been here for the weekend, might have made sense. Like, okay, let them be raucous for a couple of days, then they'll leave. The key thing is, let's not spark some kind of violent altercation where people are actually going to get hurt. So if it had just been the weekend, that might have been fine, but then it dragged on week after week, and the police were just sort of standing there, not enforcing the law, not protecting people. And that was really, really shocking to the citizens, this sense of suddenly being completely vulnerable to a breakdown in public order, not being able to have faith in the police to protect us, especially once things sort of escalated to, I'm not sure if you heard down there about the arson incident where 2 men went and started a fire in a residential building and taped the doors of the building shut in the middle of the night. And so people were quite, luckily no one was hurt. The residents, found the fire and put it out. But this was, they believe, in response to the fact that residents of the building had been sort of shouting at the protesters overnight.
Oh,
so
my God.
There was a lot of fear, and the police were just not there. And so that was the accountability. That was the failure right there. So even if they had not anticipated that the protesters were going to entrench in this way, the failure to protect our sense of safety was really the thing that the citizens of this city were wanted to see the police held accountable for.
So you said something a couple minutes ago about how they were targeting the public. Why did they go? I think the question we don't understand here is, go to Ottawa because it's the capital. We're used to associating going to the capital to target lawmakers, or to pressure lawmakers, or, because capitals represent the government. But you're saying that they were targeting the public. And then the second question is, where were these truckers coming from? I'm assuming they weren't part of big tech, wonk 94 vaccinated, given especially that it was a protest against vaccinations.
So first of all, it's important to keep in mind that, so the vast majority of the protesters were coming from outside of Ottawa, but the vast majority of truckers are also vaccinated. It's about 90%, right? So we have to be careful. We keep saying the truckers, but of course the truckers are as diverse as everyone else. They're racially diverse. They're gender diverse. My cousin, my female cousin is a trucker or has been a trucker, and they were overwhelmingly vaccinated. So we do have to be a little bit careful. We keep saying the truckers, but they're a very diverse bunch of people. But most of them were coming from outside the city. That is true. Although there was support from within the city too. And this is one of the areas where this situation becomes quite interesting politically, is that if you look at who within the city of Ottawa were supporting the truckers, it was the yoga studios, for example. So we again see how politics that sort of converge around vaccine issues, that converge around right-wing issues, are not what we expect them to be. They're not falling along the lines of cleavages that we normally expect, whether that's in terms of identity or whether that's in terms of right-left or in terms of class, that there seems to be something new happening here. And that might also help to explain why the convoy is using this really vague terminology of, freedom, which of course is an endlessly elastic term, because it provides a sort of a touch point where people can converge around an idea. So where you can sort of build solidarity from a group of people who are actually, quite diverse. So of course there are white supremacist leaders, and there are people who are willing to stand next to white supremacists. And then there are people who are there for lots of other reasons as well. And they're all they're building a coalition around this, freedom idea without really explaining what that means. And that's something we have to pay attention to in terms of the way that politics is changing. So there are three things here. One is the prevention issue. The second is the accountability issue. And the third is understanding how politics is changing and how seeing how this convoy played out may help us understand what's coming.
That's a really important marker. I mean, I think we've noticed this, and we've covered this extensively on our show, just the different groups that say, media is a big part of this, social media and like these types of shows that we do now, where it's very decentralized, and you may have, it's like a pipeline. There's a propaganda pipeline out there. You might be somebody who's into the spiritual movement and into spirituality and yoga, which frankly I am. And I have a lot of my friends that I've seen online get radicalized because they distrusted the vaccines, they distrust the government, and there's a lot of reason obviously to distrust big pharma and the government for doing a lot of horrible things. But it's predatory. The right wing has seen this as an opportunity to prey on different communities and somehow loop them in at whatever their sticking point is, whatever the thing that brings them in. And suddenly the next thing you know is your yoga instructor is hosting white nationalists that have showed up, via trucks. It's you're right. I think this is a really, really important point that we need to delve into more. It needs to be openly expressed more and considered, because if people don't understand, where this is coming from, they could also fall victim to it. So in terms of I mean, it's interesting you say that the truckers who did show up were not from Ottawa. Were there certain regions? Were they being organized in one area and being dispersed and pushed to Ottawa? Or I guess where were they being recruited? In the States, we know that there's right-wing media that the trucking community it's easy to listen to these right-wing talk shows on the radio, and left doesn't really have radio in our country. So, there's been a lot of research about how information was being spread, at least in the States, but I'm very curious how that plays out earlier in Canada.
So first of all, I should point out that, my main area of expertise is states of emergency. So so I can't speak to specifically to the sort of communication techniques that led up to the convoy. I can say that, first of all, again, we're talking about a tiny minority of truckers. So that needs to be kept in mind. That also, again, if we're sort of looking at these questions of cleavages and, do we see this as a class issue? Do we see this as an urban-rural issue? So certainly there's some focus in the West here. So if you look at two of the main leaders of the convoy movement, Tamara Lich and I think it's King as well, but it might have, I think it's King, but certainly Tamara Lich are sort of associated with this West separatist movement in Canada, which basically is advocating for the Western, all the provinces west of Ontario and the three Northern Territories to secede. Now, just again, to put this into perspective, they got 0.2% of the popular vote and no seats in Parliament. Wow. So this is a really fringe movement, and even with the so Dichter was running or was associated with the People's Party of Canada, which is sort of the furthest right party, and it also has just a really tiny fraction of support. So it's easy because the trucks are big and the media is big, right? To see this as a bigger problem or a bigger challenge. I shouldn't say all democratic discussion is important and rich, and we don't want to say. So we'll call it a challenge rather than a problem. Mm-hmm. But to see this as a bigger challenge than it is, but at the same time it would be a mistake to minimize it too, because it is, so whatever it is that's sort of drawing people together, this distrust, right? This sense of, not knowing what kind of authority to turn to, which may be the thing that's sort of helping to draw like the yoga community together with white supremacists, that is much more pervasive.
Interesting.
So there was a poll that came out, I think yesterday or the day before in Canada, that showed that just a vast majority of Canadians felt that they were angrier, more upset, more distrustful of each other, less inclined to help each other, and just generally the sense of a loss of trust in institutions, a trust in authority, and that probably was building before the pandemic, but I think was exacerbated by the pandemic. And so this may just be, if we think about the convoy as sort of like one way that this more general worrying phenomenon is bubbling up in a small portion of the population, but that more general phenomenon is something that we, as citizens on both sides of the border, need to engage. Because if you cannot trust authority, that doesn't mean you don't want authority. Right. You just cast it for some other authority, and heaven knows what. Well, we've seen the sorts of things that can happen next.
It's a very important point. It's like, we see this play out. It's like I think the question is, okay, you don't trust authority because they've failed in the past, and there's a distrust of institutions because they're not performing the way that they were designed in very unstable times. But does that mean that you don't believe in democracy? And these are big questions, I think, that we're all kind of grappling with right now. So Trudeau, though, speaking of democracy, Trudeau stood up very clearly and clamped down on these protests pretty early on. I'm curious, how did the Canadian people respond to this? Is this precedented for him to do something like that, or any prime minister too?
Well, that's an excellent question. So Trudeau, as you may know, Trudeau's father was also prime minister a very long time ago. And in 1970, when there was a separatist terrorist movement in Quebec, Trudeau, the first Prime Minister Trudeau, used the War Measures Act, which was a pretty serious piece of legislation, to call the army out into the streets of Montreal to deal with this terrorist movement that had, murdered politicians and diplomats, and they were blowing up mailboxes, etc. And this, at the time, was a very popular move. So people really supported him. But then the powers were abused. There were mass arrests. The RCMP, who were in charge of exercising those powers really, really did abuse their power. And there was an inquiry afterward. And that was why the War Measures Act was scrapped. And as history has, as time has moved on, although Canadians really supported that early on, now it's sort of generally recognized as like a black mark on the reign of the first Prime Minister Trudeau. So we may be seeing the same kind of thing play out again with Trudeau the Younger. So there was a massive, massive support. I think it was something like 70% of Canadians supported the use of the Emergencies Act. And we may want to touch on this question of, okay, people supported it. Okay, it was effective. Does that entail that it was the right thing to do? Because I think those are separate questions. But and I think he made it was a good move that the act was used quickly and effectively, and then the powers were put down quickly. That was important, both morally, but also politically.
And then, quick question, what does that mean? Yeah. What does the Emergency Act mean? What happens?
Okay. So when we got rid of the War Measures Act, which was really for wartime, during peacetime, the Canadian government, the Justice Department spent years and years and years very carefully developing this piece of legislation, the Emergencies Act, which sets out 4 different kinds of emergency. So public health, an emergency that might be related to like a natural disaster or that kind of thing, public order emergency, all the way up to a war emergency. And it gears the powers that the government can use to address that emergency very carefully to the seriousness of the situation. So the idea is, instead of this blanket emergency thing where like there's an emergency, you can do whatever, which is what a lot of states emergency legislation says. It says here are the things you can do and only these things in this kind of situation, and it builds in all of these checks and balances along the way. So the Prime Minister can ask the Governor General to declare the emergency, but then Parliament has to approve it, both the House of Commons and the Senate. And if they don't approve it, it's gone. So it can't be, just unilateral executive power. Then you have the Parliamentary Review Committee, which is just getting up and going now, which examines every single action taken under the Emergencies Act and can also, help scuttle the act as a whole, because only a handful of MPs can call, or members of Parliament can call for another debate in Parliament, which could just get rid of the act. So we have all these checks and balances, all of these safeguards in this Emergencies Act to help prevent the kinds of abuses that we saw with the War Measures Act early on. So Trudeau used it. He was the first one to use it. He used it fast. He gave the powers back. Now we're having the Parliamentary Review Committee. We're going to have an inquiry. And this question, like, okay, it was effective. Okay, people supported it, but was it strictly necessary? This is what we're gonna see next.
Is there a sense, now that there's been at least a beginning of a review of who was funding this? Was there funding behind this? Obviously, we saw some Facebook groups pop up, and that's happening all over the world. That could be organic. It could also be boosted. But is there any sense?
There was information leading up to the declaration of the Emergencies Act that through the GoFundMe platform and the other funding platforms, that about half the money was coming from the United States. And that was, of course,
individuals or organizations.
I'm not sure exactly. Certainly a lot of individuals. I'm not sure about organizations. So certainly that was a matter for some concern. People did point out that the same thing is true when there are environmental protests in Canada, that a lot of the money supporting those protests also comes globally. And so there were, questions, all the way through. People were saying, okay, are we using a double standard here?
I mean, the implications, let me just intercept there. If you are drilling in Canada and on Indigenous land, I think that there are more global implications than vice versa. Sorry, just.
And there are global implications from the convoy as well. Yes. And I'm not, so I'm not personally taking a position on whether, whether that's ever appropriate, just that people had raised these kinds of questions with respect to the funding. It might be useful for people to know that all of those funds are still frozen, and there is a class action lawsuit that was launched by citizens of Centretown in Ottawa, and so all those funds that were donated are frozen and are being held in escrow pending the result of that lawsuit. And so all those funds that people donated might end up going to compensate the businesses that lost collectively, tens and tens and tens of millions of dollars, and the citizens who had to put up with this, relentless, permanent hearing loss, causing noise, etc. So that money is now frozen in escrow, pending the hearing on this lawsuit.
And where were they saying the money was going to go, anyways? I mean, what did it gas or was it paying people?
So my understanding, and again, this is not my areas of expertise, was that it was meant to compensate truckers for the cost of food and the cost of fuel. And, they had set up this whole carnival. There was a bouncy castle. There was a hot tub. They were setting up, food stalls, and right across from my office in the public park, they basically taken the whole thing over and set up all of these festival type things. So my understanding was that was what the money was for. We do know that Tamara Litch, for example, had $1.3 million that she had taken from this fund in her personal account. That's also been frozen in escrow. She handed that over. It's been frozen in escrow pending the result of these lawsuits. It's also worth noting that under both the provincial state of emergency and the national, I believe also the national one, but certainly under the provincial state of emergency, the organizers can be held liable for the costs of resolving an emergency that they cause. So these tens and tens and tens of millions of dollars and then of course that hundreds of millions of dollars in losses from the from blocking the border could end up being a liability for the organizers.
Was anybody hurt? You mentioned hearing loss, but were there any other sorts of physical? Was anybody hurt along the way, like confronting them, or anything else?
So it's worth noting that the police, once the Emergencies Act came into force, and there was this cooperation between the RCMP, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, that is, the Ontario Provincial Police and the local police, and police forces, members of police forces from across Canada who came to help out, that was pretty much, if you're going to have police action in a demonstration situation, extremely well behaved. And as far as we know, someone was very slightly injured. But other than that, a situation which could have become very violent did not. And that's something that hopefully will help restore some faith in our local police. Before that, in terms of altercations with the protesters, I know that the police are currently investigating 400 different incidents that took place. So there was a situation where some convoy members went and tried to get food from the Shepherds of Good Hope, which is a downtown homeless service or service provision center. So you can get clothes, you can get help with finding housing and jobs, etc. And they were told they could not access meals there, and then beat up a person of color, a homeless person of color, and they were shouting slurs at the security guards. They knocked down. So we have a very much beloved little local ice cream shop, and one of the employees was knocked to the ground on his way to work and yelled at for wearing a mask. These are just the situations that I know about personally, but we know there are 400. And then one of my students who was out having a cigarette, luckily he had his dog with him, had some protesters walk by and start yelling homophobic slurs at him and threatening to beat him up. And so he was very, shaken and upset. So certainly there was an air of disorder and violence that was quite unnerving to residents. And again, there were plenty of convoy members who were peaceful. And we should be glad that this didn't erupt into mass violence, which we were all very worried about. So, this could have been much, much worse. But at the same time, we do need to be aware that there were these, very horrible violent incidents, notably the arson, which really scared people, understandably, and just the sense that of fear walking down the street. We became afraid of our own flag because that became a symbol, right? And so my kid had to cross the police line to get to school. And so just having to brief your young child as she walks to school, like what to do, not to make eye contact, what to do if she sees violence, etc. These were things that certainly in our boring, sleepy little capital were not things we were used to.
Mm-hmm. And how many days did it go on for?
Sorry?
How many days did it go on for?
It was about 3 weeks.
3 weeks, okay.
Yeah, I think 23 days.
Is there, people have been talking about it a little bit, is there any sense that this may pick up again?
Sorry, I missed that.
Is there any sense that this may pick up again?
I don't think so. In part because, or not in this particular form, in part because the police now, have assured everyone that they are ready to prevent that kind of entrenchment from happening again. Also, the organizers have all been arrested. Some of them have been let out on bail, some not. Their assets are still frozen for the time being. And certainly if we see these like massive financial consequences, so if they're held liable, that's going to make people think twice about the way that they express themselves politically. So again, we want people to express themselves politically. We just don't want them holding the public hostage. You had asked earlier about that, and I don't think I addressed it at the time, that some of the organizers were basically saying, look, people of Ottawa, we're sorry that you're having a rough time, but that's because we want you to tell the Governor General, this is just a massive misunderstanding of how our democracy works, that she needs to throw out the elected government so that we, the convoy, and together with her, she's the Queen's representative, just basically form a new government. So this was truly absurd. But the idea was to sort of pressure us to pressure the Governor General for whatever that's worth. And that really is just that's not acceptable democratic behavior. You don't try to throw out the democratically elected government by torturing the citizens of a capital city. Express yourself, yell, say what you want, but that is just not appropriate democratic behavior.
Where have I heard that before? January 6th. It's unreal. Professor, really, really fascinating. Thank you so much for this update on the convoy, and hopefully, this won't happen again in any form or rebuild, in any other city in the world right now. Maybe gas prices will affect it, that alone. But it's really an interesting aspect of our unrest right now, and I'm sorry that it really had to take a toll on your community in Ottawa, because citizens don't deserve that. So thank you so much for joining us. And from one Nomi to another, I appreciate that.
And just to end on an up note, I don't think that our community has for a long time felt as tightly connected. Yep. Everyone has signs up in their windows that say, we love our city. We scrawled, we love our neighbors on our window. And so the upside is when you go through something together, it builds solidarity, and that can also be a good thing. Indeed. And hopefully more good out of it. Professor Nomi Claire Lazar, thank you very much for joining us, and hope to see you again soon. Thank you very much. All right, we will be right back with our next guest. We're going to be talking about what's going on in the prison industrial complex is where I'm going to leave it, and how climate is affecting the prison industrial complex with Alleen Brown. So I did not sleep well last night. Hate to break it to everyone. That's why I'm looking a little pale today. I didn't sleep well last night because my Twitter alerts were waking me up. I'll just leave that there. If you know what I'm talking about, you know what I'm talking about. But, luckily I was able to eventually get to sleep and get a couple of hours of shut eye because I use Sunset Lake Cbd. Sunset Lake Cbd has been my go-to sleep aid for a bit now. Basically, I learned about them from Sam Cedar. Sam Cedar was raving about CBD. I was like, I think it's a scam because I had tried some, from some like bodega that I spent $100 on. And he's like, no, you got to try Sunset Lake. And then I did, and he was right. It really, really helped. I started with the gummies. I then got addicted to the gummies. So now I've weaned off the gummies, but you should definitely try the gummies. But I use the CBD oil. I drop a little bit in my water or my tea at night.
The CBD oil now comes with melatonin, so it'll help you go to sleep and stay asleep. The CBD helps you stay asleep. Unfortunately, I didn't do it at the beginning of the night. I had to do it midway through the night around 5 o'clock in the morning, which is real fun. But luckily, I have the product. Sunset Lake CBD is a farmer-owned company that ships craft CBD products directly from their farm in Vermont that used to be a dairy farm, a Ben and Jerry's dairy farm. They decided to diversify it, and now they grow premium hemp, and they send it right from their farm to your door. They take care of their workers. And when you take care of them, they're supporting and enhancing their rural economy, because rural economies, unfortunately, are not supported, as we know. But Sunset Lake CBD is doing everything they can to make sure that the community that they support in Vermont is completely supported through having a $15 minimum wage, having their employees own the majority of their company. And then on top of that all, they give back to independent shows like ours and the David Pakman Show. And of course, the Majority Report. You can go to sunsetlakecbd.com today and you will get 20% off of your order. If you type in Nomi, N-O-M-I, go to sunsetlakecbd.com, type in Nomi, and they've got all sorts of new products right now out there. I've been hearing from folks who like the dog biscuits. I think it's something that if you've had small dogs in particular, they get really a lot of anxiety when you leave. And the dog biscuits help. They're also full of, it's purely like natural ingredients. I think you can eat the dog biscuits if you want to. I think Sam Cedar may have at one point, but it totally chills out your dog if they get a lot of anxiety. Mine gets anxiety. He starts chewing on his, oh, it's so sad. He chews on his own skin, and then he has to wear the little cone for a long time because he just does it. But the CBD has definitely helped him, and I know it's helped other people as well. Go to sunsetlakecbd.com, type in Nomi, N-O-M-I, and you will get 20% off of your entire order. And check out all the other sales. They have a ton of sales all the time with lots of interesting products. Go check it out, sunsetlakecbd.com. Our next guest is going to tell us about the state of affairs in our criminal justice system. We've had Alleen Brown on before. She's a New York-based reporter for the Intercept. She focuses on environmental justice issues. And right now she has a series out, a brand new series titled Climate and Punishment. It's jarring, frankly. Alleen, thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
So this is obviously a beat that you've been working on for a while, but I'm actually quite shocked that there hasn't been any reporting on, extensive reporting at least, on how the criminal justice system it pushes up against climate. And to see what you've come out with, it seems it's already a rough human rights situation in so many prisons across this country. Add to it how climate is affecting it seems hard to ignore. So what led you in this direction?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was exactly what you're talking about. You know, I think increasingly when a big hurricane happens, when a wildfire happens, and it's impacting people who are incarcerated, in the rare cases that people who are incarcerated or advocates connect with the media, you more and more see these fast pieces kind of reacting to these crises. And so I really wanted to find a way to do something that stepped back a little bit and looked more comprehensively about how the climate crisis is impacting detention facilities. So, I started talking to my colleague, senior research engineer Akil Harris, about potentially doing something with all these data sets, combining these data sets of, we have one with 6,500 detention facilities from the Department of Homeland Security. And then there's lots of data sets looking at, flood risk, wildfire risk, storm risk, heat risk. I thought we could find a way to put these things together. So Akil is amazing with data, and he was really the one who created this big interactive map where you can search almost any detention facility in the US and find out what kind of heat risk, wildfire risk, and flood risk it has.
How are you able to even get that data?
It really relied on partnerships with people who have been working with each of these individual areas.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a team of researchers at UCLA led by Nick Shapiro. They're called the Carceral Ecologies Project, and Nick had already been looking at the way this big database of facilities was being impacted by other kinds of environmental issues, like water quality issues. So the Carceral Ecologies folks were really key to figuring out how to work with the prison data. And then, for heat data, we worked with Union of Concerned Scientists, this really great nonprofit that had looked at county by county heat data and how the heat is going to increase in the coming years as the climate crisis deepens. For the flood data, we teamed up with an organization called the First Street Foundation that has property-specific risk ratings, more for residential properties, but we found a way to make it work for these prison campuses. And then finally, the federal government put together a wildfire risk database a couple years ago, and we worked closely with their contractor, Pyrologics. This guy, Joe Scott, is a really great wildfire researcher who helped us figure out how to work with the wildfire data. So, it was really a lot of people involved in making this happen.
So let's start with the heat risk. What kind of things did you discover?
Yeah, so we discovered there people who are incarcerated are already facing really severe issues with heat. We found that about a third of the detention facilities across the U.S. already are located in counties that see more than 50 days a year with heat indexes over 90 degrees, which is enough to make people dealing with a range of health issues quite sick. A lot of these facilities don't have air conditioning. That's something that our data doesn't quite capture, is which facilities have the infrastructure to manage some of these problems and which don't at all. We also found that the number of facilities at that heat level will rise to about 3/4 of the detention facilities currently existing in the US by 2100. Even more worrisome, perhaps, today, no carceral institution is located in a county with more than 50 days a year at 105 degrees, which is a level that the National Weather Service considers dangerous. By 2100, almost 700 facilities will be, mostly in Texas, Florida, Louisiana. So, this is already a really severe problem, and it's about to get much worse.
We're looking at the map right now for our podcast listeners, and I'm just floored by how many prisons there are in this country and jails. I know this isn't even a complete map, and when you see it visually and just how many are in your town, like if you zoom into Arizona right now, there's only so many cities in Arizona. You hear about the large prisons, but it's really jarring, and I'm sure that there's many that aren't even on this map. Wow.
Yeah.
So, in terms of wildfire risk, wildfires are obviously happening all throughout the year now, we're learning. How does that impact a prison? And what did you learn?
Yeah. So, we focused especially on California in our reporting, since California has been so, deeply impacted by wildfires. And I think that's where we're starting to see some people organize around issues of wildfires. And I can talk a little bit about that. But I would also say that one of the most notable things, or one of the most surprising things to me, was the way that the wildfire risk that facilities across the U.S. are facing, particularly Florida. I think Florida had more state facilities facing extreme wildfire risk than California. It doesn't get a lot of attention for this, but the vegetation on top of some of these swampy areas is hot enough to kind of travel across that wet landscape. And actually right now, Florida is facing some pretty significant wildfires that have caused, can't remember if it's a jail or a prison, but a detention facility to evacuate.
Interesting.
Of course, the surrounding
and it's the Panhandle.
Yeah, exactly. Of course, the surrounding community began to evacuate, at least several days before the detention facility was finally evacuated. So I would say that, oh, go ahead.
And when prisoners voice concern, I mean, I know this is in your reporting, what are they met with? I mean, do they have advocates fighting for them on being able to evacuate if there's a fire risk? This is insane.
Yeah, I mean, I think that people's biggest advocates are always family members. It's often loved ones and family members that are connecting to advocates with more access to, policymakers. So via those like loved ones advocacy, there has started to be some organizing around getting facilities evacuated when wildfires are in the area. You increasingly see people, I think in California for one of the fires in the last couple of years, people actually showed up to the head of the corrections department's home, kind of demanding evacuations. But, evacuations still tend to be much more rare for detention facilities than for the surrounding communities. And the corrections departments tend to be very sort of hesitant to share information about what their emergency plans are, what their evacuation plans are. A lot of people just don't, without transparency, a lot of people don't believe that they're very robust.
Wow. That's unbelievable. Okay. And in terms of flooding, I can imagine many parts of the country are going to be severely affected by climate change and floods.
Yeah. So we identified more than 600 facilities across the U.S. Facing major to extreme flood risk. We really honed in on one facility in Florida that experienced flooding this past year. That's the Cross City detention facility, or it's a state prison. And
where's that?
One of
in Florida, like just for context.
Yep, that's in Florida. It's
no, I mean, and
County.
where in Florida? Where in Florida?
Yeah, so it's kind of I don't know if it's quite the Panhandle, but it's sort of in that inner arc along the Gulf Coast, and it's in a quite rural county, Dixie County, that flooded really severely over the summer, but got hardly any national attention. This county, a lot of the county's economy relies on the prison, to function. And so as people's homes were being inundated, the prison was too. One person who was incarcerated said that his cell was flooded with ankle deep water, with human waste floating in the water, and was stuck there for several hours before there was an evacuation. But one thing I think that it is really important to note, especially where it comes to flooding, is that it's not just facilities that we identified as having significant flood risk that are flooding. Cross City does have severe flood risk according to our database. However, we noted a number of facilities with a history of flooding that don't have high flood risk. The issue is not that they're in a flood risky area. It's that the infrastructure itself can't handle, storms and precipitation events.
Well, that's interesting. So they were never designed to deal with any sort of extreme weather, and now with more extreme weather, it's further pushing it to the limits. Have you been able to document? I know it's sometimes difficult with climate change, but have you been able to document any deaths related to climate change in these facilities, at least over the past few years?
I think that where you see the most deaths is where it comes to extreme heat events.
Right.
It's actually the deaths of incarcerated people in Texas that have forced the state to begin to install air conditioning in more facilities. They're way behind on that. But I would also say that with heat, a lot of times a death that might be associated with heat is not documented as such. You might have an existing health problem that's really exacerbated by being in a place with no air conditioning for an extended period of time, or that's exacerbated by a sudden spike in heat, a sudden heat wave that your body isn't prepared to handle. If you have a heart attack and it happens to be on a hot day, the corrections department isn't necessarily going to document it as it's being heat related.
I'm shocked. Alleen, has there been any, since you've been doing this reporting, you mentioned Texas is starting to install air conditioners, but have you seen any other sort of progress? Any organizations speaking out? Anything?
Yeah, so I would say that people are increasingly organizing around this issue. I mentioned California. There's a coalition called CURB that is demanding, they're saying that they don't want California facilities to invest in infrastructure and repairs. Rather, they want 10 facilities closed in the next 5 years. And one of the things that they're focused on is kind of environmental problems, the impact of the wildfires. In some places, generators have failed as the wildfires strike. So this infrastructure issue is a real problem. They don't want the state to pour money into infrastructure. They want facilities shut down. The other place I would note is again, Texas. Family members and loved ones of people who have been impacted by the heat while incarcerated have really started to organize around, or have organized for the past few years around Texas installing air conditioning in its state prisons. It's really a grassroots effort that's led by the loved ones of incarcerated people or formerly incarcerated people.
Jesus. This is really important reporting. Thank you so much, Alleen, for bringing this to light and for sharing it. And I hope, as you continue to learn more, please share it with us because we'd love to get the word out as much as possible. Alleen Brown, thank you, as always, for joining us. You can go check out the Climate and Punishment series at The Intercept. Alleen is a reporter for The Intercept, and she focuses on environmental justice issues. Go check out her reporting there. It's really in-depth and wonderful. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
All right, we will be right back after this break. We're going to talk about the war on education and how the right wing is organizing aggressively against the Democrats, and really what are the roots behind it, because it is a much bigger story than meets the eye.
Somewhere today that somewhere is in San Francisco, the school board recall election. It's being fueled by backlash to some progressive policies, but more than that, might be a potential warning sign to progressives everywhere. When you have the phrase, even liberal San Francisco parents, well, they're signaling they've hit their limits, then you may have a political problem. 3 school board members, including the president, Gabriela Lopez, are up for recall in the solidly Democratic city for pursuing symbolic liberal causes like renaming schools, from people like Dianne Feinstein, as classrooms stayed shut due to pandemic restrictions. The recall effort has the backing of Democratic Mayor London Breed. She had that enough is enough speech on shoplifting a few weeks back. And according to the San Francisco Chronicle, has attracted nearly $2 million in campaign spending. So, folks, parental anger has been a force ever since schools went remote. And the political fallout around this issue has only intensified as we approach the midterms. And it hasn't mattered if it's in blue America or red America.
Okay, well, thank you, Chuck Todd, for your insights on how blue America and red America should exist without teachers. That's really the message we should be pushing out on MSNBC. Okay, guys, let's just take a moment and digest what's happening. And this is San Francisco in a blue state, in a blue city with a blue mayor who is supposed to be, supporting the people who back the Democratic Party, the largest union in the country, the largest public service workers. In this moment when workers are under attack, this is happening. And I think we really need to digest this and register what's happening. I am so grateful that our next guest has been on the front lines of this. She's one of the three members who have been facing the attacks. Commissioner Allison Collins is the former Board of Election Commissioner for the San Francisco Unified School District, recently recalled because what on earth? Okay, Allison, thank you so much for joining us. Just to start with that, and I am so sorry that you've had to go through this. I do want to also note that I find it fascinating that the three people that were being recalled are also, women and people of color. So,
and educators too,
and educators, of course, yes.
Yeah.
Okay, where do I even begin with this? First off, how are you doing? Let's start with that.
I'm doing well. I think, considering this has been going on for a really long time, and you talk to anybody who served in education at all, right? Teachers right now are burning out like crazy, but school board members across the country have been under unprecedented attack for the last year. So I think anybody who's just, able to persist, and, it's been incredibly difficult to do any, real work with all these school board attacks, recalls, and things like that. But I think, this is a volunteer job. This isn't, most of us don't get paid. And you look across the country, most of the folks who volunteer to do this work do it because they love public education and they love, public schools. And so, I don't know what else to say. I'm grateful to have been able to serve during the pandemic, because I think, at least in San Francisco, as compared to other parts of the country, we were able to take a lot of steps to keep our communities a lot safer than we're seeing across the nation.
I think it's so important that you said it's a volunteer job, because, teachers across this country are really not paid anywhere near a livable wage. My mother was a teacher. I have family members. I'm very close to the teaching community, very good friends of mine who, in Arizona, were part of the Red State Revolt there. And I have one of my friends in particular, I talked to recently, has two children, and, they can barely pay their rent in Arizona. And they've been forced to move many times, but they're so dedicated to teaching that it's really kind of beautiful to see that kind of dedication from folks who are so invested in making sure that we preserve our basis. I mean, this is the basis of democracy. This is what's going to get us out of whatever mess we're in. So it's really horrifying to see, especially in San Francisco, these type of efforts successful. So I know that you guys have issued a recall report. I want to start with just how it happened. How did this happen? Why San Francisco? And why your school board?
Well, I'll tell you, it's actually happening across the country. And I think I appreciate shows like this where we can really have meaningful conversations. As you know, most of the mainstream media is about sound bites, and a lot of it is funded by PR companies. And what I'm seeing nationally is an attack on education, public education specifically. And so when you look at the larger context, San Francisco is no different than any other part of the country right now. You have an unprecedented number of recalls this year. In 2006 to 2020, there was an average of 23 recalls a year against 52 school board members. This past year, you had 84 as compared to 23, and against 215 members. So you see a huge spike in recalls nationally. You also see, just all this energy right now with these, the Republican Party last year became the party of parents with, they credited that messaging and that strategy to winning the Glenn Youngkin, election. You have also just a rise of recalls related to school reopening and parents, quote, parents coming into schools and, raging against wokeness through anti-CRT policies, as well as, there's also a weaponization of the Stop Asian Hate movement with this, you're seeing Asian American conservative groups fighting against affirmative action.
Right.
So all of those, there's a confluence of things that's been happening nationally. And basically what you see is the Republican Party and right wing, they understand that if they want to take back power, they're going to mess with our right to vote, but they're also going to take back local elections. And school boards are pathways to power, right?
That's right.
Most people, I'm running because I actually am an educator and I want to stay on the school board, but a lot of folks enter into school boards and, local county offices, and then they move on to higher office. And so this is really a national strategy. And you see it. I mean, they're telling us what their strategy is. You have Steve Bannon has said, we're taking action. And that action we are taking is we are taking over school boards. He said that, right?
Yep.
You have Chris Rufo, who crafted the whole anti-CRT. It's a campaign. It's a messaging campaign. And he said, it's time to clean house in America, remove the attorney general, lay siege on the universities, abolish the teachers unions, and overturn school boards. They are telling us what they're doing. And for some reason, mainstream media wants to kind of approach this as a whole bunch of individual issues, like San Francisco.
That's right.
All the woke people. And then you have Florida, you have parents that are mad about CRT. Obviously San Francisco, you're not going to sell a strategy of anti-CRT in San Francisco. But what you did have was you had parents upset about school renaming, or you have parents that are mad that we desegregated one of our elite high schools, right? Those are issues that involve race and segregation and these kind of culture war issues. But it's really just a messaging campaign. You have some really standard, messaging and arguments, but then they just get tailored for a local market. And so in San Francisco, we don't have any successful Republican candidates. So you have moderates and you have Democrats. In other cities, they would be probably running as Republicans. And so that's why I think it is, we can disagree as Democrats as well. But I think it is very disingenuous to say that this is, Democrats versus progressives when you have $500,000 being funded by actual Republicans, like $2 million for a recall election. And many of the donors are Republican donors. David Sachs fundraised for DeSantis in San Francisco. He was one of the primary donors. We have William Obendorf, who's also a Republican billionaire. So, there were parents, Democratic parents, who also voted for the recall. But I think largely this recall got its juice from, neoliberals, Republicans and libertarians and corporate interests. I mean, we even had Visa and the Realtors Association, right? The charter associations. Those are the organizations that were really fueling this effort, that got it on the ballot. And just like across the country, right, they weaponized parental frustration and anger about schools being closed, and also weaponized, some of the old school anger about change. And so this is just another take back kind of America movement, but now we're seeing it's in San Francisco, and but utilizing the same tactics, really same messaging strategies that we're seeing nationally.
I mean, it's so fascinating, and I say this a lot on the show because I want people to understand, as you're doing. The teachers union is it's obviously teachers and educators have been on the front lines during this pandemic and have dealt with so many different issues along the way. Not to mention these smear campaigns and actual political campaigns with a lot of money to take out educators for volunteer positions, as you said. But the largest public sector union, the largest public sector workers in this country are educators. The largest donors to the Democratic Party are the teachers' unions. If we don't think this is a Republican play to weaken Democrats, and I think we need to say this out loud more, because London Breed or anybody, any Democrat who runs with the D next to them and is in office and supports these efforts should, frankly, in my opinion, be exposed for not being in line with the Democratic Party. You want to weaken your party, you weaken teachers. And I think the word is out about charters at this point, so it doesn't look like this is a charter campaign, but obviously there's a lot of charter money going into this.
Where it's going, honestly, is vouchers. So
okay.
Charters are dead, and you're seeing a lot of activity with vouchers. And, with the pandemic, you saw a rise in homeschooling, which also that's privatized, unregulated education, right?
Yeah.
So you talk to anybody who follows charters, they were seeing this too. Even when we closed down and all these micro schools came out, those are also, it's basically a way to privatize public education dollars, moving them out of local oversight. And this is where it comes to democracy, right? I'm an unelected official. If you don't like me, you can vote me out. But charters, there's no real oversight unless,
right.
Every few years you go in and you say, okay, I'd like to renew my charter. But on a day-to-day basis, we have meetings twice a month. Parents show up and they voice their concerns. It's very easy to see, your local government in action when you go to vouchers or you go to charter schools. You're basically allowing a private organization, even if it's a nonprofit, it's a private organization to manage those dollars and run public education. And so, that's, so you've got, I think, really a confluence of interests. You've got maybe more conservative voters who are unhappy that schools are embracing anti-racist education, pro-LGBTQ education. They don't like that. You have conservative, just, Republican or right-wing interests that see an opportunity to take political power through mobilizing parent anger. And then you also just have opportunists, people who can make money off the system. And I think that's why you see charters. And then you also see the tech sector. There's a lot of opportunity, for them as well, as we've gone online, for them to make money. And, so you have kind of, like I said, a confluence of interests coming together and seeing an opportunity during a time of really great distress for our country and based on the pandemic.
I'm happy you mentioned Steve Bannon, because I caught an article in the New York Times I've referenced quite a bit on the show in December, where the Proud Boys proudly announced that they are running for city councils and school boards now. Proud Boys, who I'm going to guess are not educators,
Hopefully not.
Hopefully not. I'm just going to I help us find one. I'm very curious if there's one out there. But I mean, this is really the framing that I think is so important for people to understand. You can have educators on these school boards who understand their communities, who understand the system, who understand the children, or you could have Proud Boys. And, I just don't understand how someone like a London Breed could so aggressively champion this. And have you had any sort of communication with her? What is the teachers union, whether it's local or national?
The teachers union is a big issue because when you look at California, we educate the most children in the country as a state. And then you look at California Teachers Association as the largest union in our state. So if you want to run for governor, you want CTA backing you. And so it is a statewide issue, and San Francisco definitely is a leader, right? When it comes to districts in our state, we're one of the larger districts, and we have influence on things like that. And so, there are, like I said, we don't have traditional, like in other states, you have Democrats and Republicans. We have moderates and progressives. but and Mayor Breed is associated with moderate kind of political party, and then we have progressive. So we have those similar kinds of battles in our city around who's in charge of City Hall and who makes decisions, and so there are not on a national scale but locally very important kind of power plays happening with the school board because me and my colleague were considered progressive, and so those play out on a local level. But I also think our elections cost so much money, and if you want, I ran my election for $40,000. It was grassroots, similar to my colleagues. In the last 4 elections, $1 million was raised by school board candidates in total. And so to have a recall where they're able to raise $2 million just for a recall election, right? That's a real signal to, and some of the people behind the recall were failed Board of Ed candidates who raised more money. And so I think this is just really a way of kind of folks are flexing their power politically and showing that they can, if they can't run in a regular election, they're going to use recalls. I think it sets a very dangerous precedent in California, but they can flex their power and say, well, we don't have to run in a regular election. We can do a recall election, which is a lower voter turnout election, and we can get candidates that weren't able to get elected in a regular election on there because we have, less people of color voting and less working class folks. And so I think, that's where I think it gets really troubling is that it sets us up, in California, at least, you can recall anybody you don't like in an off-season election with enough cash.
You brought up such an interesting point, and I want to reiterate it and maybe ask you the numbers if you have them. So this is not a normal election. So when you don't have it, it's low turnout in general happens in California, unfortunately, and especially when it's not a presidential year. But then municipal elections in particular are low turnout, and pretty much everywhere in the country at this point. So it's extremely low turnout. But in terms of how low,
so in a regular election, 75% of San Franciscans normally vote for a school board election. We had 20.
That's actually great, by the way. That's a very great number compared to Los Angeles, which is 9%, I think.
We're a very political city, and it's a small city in a sense. So it's kind of like a big town. When you look at LA or New York, you have millions of people. San Francisco has about 800,000, maybe 900,000 people, but you get about 75% of the electorate voting. In the recall, you had 25%. So you have a much smaller percentage, and then the folks who vote are a different demographic than you would get normally. But additionally, I think what's also important is in a regular election, when I was raising money, you're asking everyone to help you get money. $500 is the max people can donate. But because this was a proposition, it wasn't an election.
Oh, interesting.
So because it's a proposition, there's no limit. So that's why you have somebody like Arthur Rock can drop $100,000 at a pop. And ultimately, he ended up donating $500,000. That's a quarter of this whole budget.
Wow.
You can't, 500,000 compared to 500, right? So that's one person can have basically, buy an election. And additionally, I think there's a win-win for them because even if they lose, right, they've been able to amass a large amount of money and they can use it however they'd like. So if I'm running for me. If I win or lose, that money I can kind of, any leftover money, I can spend it here or there. But this is an opportunity for them to raise wildly, great amounts of money. Even if they had lost this election, they can take that money and then funnel it into candidates that they want to run in the fall. And so I think the reason this is so important, and I'm really glad that you're doing the show, is this is not just about San Francisco. This is what's happening nationally. And I think that's why you have former Vice President Mike Pence kind of crowing about, yes, this is a repudiation of wokeness by the Democrats and kind of we're coming to get you. This is a national model that I think the Republicans are going to want to play out nationally. And through these irregular kind of elections, and through, in California, this ability to run a proposition and establish, basically they're getting voter lists together.
Yes, exactly.
A whole bunch of fundraising.
It's an organizing moment for them.
Right. And so even if they had lost, they would have kind of been ahead for the November election. And I think we're going to see this between now and November, all across the country. We're going to see, people sharing this as a strategy for taking over kind of local political power. And then that is a play for 2024. So, that's very clear to me. Like, if you've got Bannon and the Republican Party saying this is our strategy, they're playing it out. And and they've invested in this model. If they can do it in San Francisco, then they can do it anywhere.
What I don't understand, though, is California. Yes, it used to be a Republican state, and there, are parts of California that are definitely more conservative. It is a lot of money and effort to put into California, in which, unless I'm not seeing something, and they're depending on low turnout on other parts. Yeah, go ahead.
California as a state, we educate most of the children here. So when you want to look at school boards, and like CTA is the largest union, so if you want to really disrupt, and also, just looking at San Francisco, other than Los Angeles and Oakland, we've been able to really keep charters out of our district. And I'm one of the largest kind of proponents, so I'm a great target, but I think as a city, it's a smaller city, and San Francisco doesn't like big box retailers, so you just say, look, Walmart pays for charters, and then people who don't even know anything about public schools will oppose them. They're right. Not popular. But if you can get charters into San Francisco, I think we are, a real trophy. And so I think that is why you would want to invest. I mean, if you've got somebody like Charlie Kirk, regularly talks about San Francisco, right? And, we're on, the Tucker Carlson show as, regularly as when we advance progressive policies. So to have this as a win is a feather in their cap. And I do think they've been really, really honing, their strategies. And I think, you've got the on the ground strategy, but you also have tech, and you have a lot of disinformation. Twitter, we have Facebook. And what I've also noticed in this campaign is a really just intense amount of disinformation online that it's always existed, but a real explosion of
weaponized,
targeted harassment. And what is Asha Rangappa? She's a former FBI agent. She talks about domestic information warfare. And I think we're used to thinking of it on a national level. I think there are right-wing folks who are figuring out how to weaponize information. And if you're in a small, San Francisco is maybe a big city, but it's small enough of a community that you can really disrupt how people get information. And that was, I think, one of the most frustrating things about this was just the amount of disinformation. This whole idea that we didn't open schools because we were so focused on renaming schools is just misinformation. We weren't talking about it. But if you repeat something enough and enough, then people think, gosh, that seems really silly. And I'm like, yes, it is silly. We didn't do it, but it doesn't matter. And so
yes, exactly.
When you have that kind of reach, and you have the ability to, weaponize Twitter, in a sense, you have trolls and bots attacking people, shutting people down, as well as just dumping a whole bunch of misinformation. It just overwhelms the system. And especially during a pandemic, when people are not out talking to each other and they're relying on Twitter and Facebook and these social media spaces, those are our public spaces where we share information. And so that's something I also is going to be expanding, I think, in all types of races locally. And people are not aware of how much misinformation is out there and how much it's weaponized and how much, how many bots and trolls and just targeted inorganic campaigns are, we're not, it's not just Russia. It's also.
Oh, no. We are definitely used to this on our show. We literally I start off the show saying I said, I'm very tired. I didn't sleep. You know why? Because I woke up to 1,500 bots attacking me over, challenging somebody. I mean, it is warfare, and it's, I said, Congress needs to do something about this. And of course, they started calling me, it was like a McCarthyist attack. I'm like, no, that's actually not what I'm talking about. Congress has a job, and it'd be great if our government operated, unless you like being in a completely, unregulated free market space. If that's the case, maybe you're not on the left, but these are my opinions on this.
It's really important. And I just want to add, it wasn't just me getting targeted. Parents that would comment or share were personally getting targeted and doxxed by some of these campaigns. And so it becomes really unsafe, not just for me, but for student leaders who are speaking out about things. And so that really shuts down democratic dialogue, and it keeps people, there were a lot of parents who were scared about reopening, I read policies to help keep our schools safe. And I said, will you be comfortable with me sharing that you helped me with this? And they all declined because they were getting targeted. And so it really isn't impacting our democracy.
That's right. It's there to silence people. It's there to silence dissent. And these are also spaces, I have to reiterate this over and over again. These are spaces, these algorithms are not just designed by white men, but they are feeding they're promoting and pushing white male perspectives. And, when you don't have other perspectives in a room, it's the legacy of Gamergate. We saw what happened with Gamergate. It's now playing out in real life, and in whether it's YouTube politics or on in real impactful campaigns involving school boards. I mean, this is very, very real. And I will never shut up about this. And I am really happy that you're not either. I've had a ton of stuff thrown at me. I imagine you are. And there's many times when I get frustrated and I feel unsafe. I had to move apartments. I'm just going to be real. And I'm sure you're in these situations too. And it's important for us to talk about it so that people who might be white males are aware of it and can use their privilege in this space to call it out, because it's, I often feel like if people don't feel it, they don't see it, they don't think it's real.
Yeah.
But this is a volunteer position for you, and you've really put yourself out there, and you've taken the worst types of attacks from the worst types of people. My only question I have left is before we tie this up, and we'd love to have you back on, by the way. This is such a big conversation that I feel like we barely even touched it. Is there an effort to reform the recall effort? I mean, we've seen how it's been used as a weapon, and I imagine there's no elected official in California isn't worried about being recalled themselves right now.
Well, locally, I think immediately we have a board of supervisors. They started discussing policies to make it more difficult to file recalls. I think it's really great that they realize, oh, I'm next, and then they decided to implement this new policy. But, I think California is unique in it may be different in different states, but I think the big picture is that, as I said before, we have this national strategy of really disenfranchising voters, and folks, are using whatever tactics they have available to them locally. And so we have redistricting, we have, people's voter rights being restricted. And they're also looking for ways that they can either force resignations via information attacks, which is what happened to me. They tried to get me to resign. And then, but additionally, you see it in Boston. There were several school board members that were forced to resign based on claims that they were anti-Asian or anti-white for integrating Boston Latin. You see this in Loudoun County, Virginia, around Thomas Jefferson High School, all across the country with anti-CRT, there's a lot of these. And so there's a kind of a direct link between, if they can't do it policy-wise, they're doing it through propaganda and these information attacks. So, whatever works,
It would be really amazing if there were organizations out there, and I know that they exist, that could do briefings for press on like the strategies, because I do think a lot of people fall for this. I think some people just don't care and they have their own agendas and they're going to do what they need to do because they're on networks that are funded by a lot of the folks. But there are definitely some folks who fall for it. And I think, media literacy around how media literacy for the media, not for the viewers, on how this misinformation is being weaponized and these tactics are being used and who's behind them, and not to fall for a CRT because they can come up with any. I don't even give it power, because the more you give it power, the more it becomes a thing. And it's just like attacks on teachers' unions because they don't want the Democrats to be in power. I mean, that's really what this is about. They want power.
Organized labor.
That's exactly.
When you have organized labor in San Francisco, they team up, they work with other labor unions. They increase that power because they work in solidarity with one another. And so you have companies like Uber, or other companies, they don't want labor to be powerful in any way, because they all, labor unions like working together because they organize. So definitely. There's a lot to talk about, and I do
Allison,
really you and just being able to talk, but also just all the other content that you provide is really, really wonderful.
You're very kind. Commissioner Allison Collins, I'm so grateful for your work and your courage and putting yourself out there and speaking. And I hope more folks have you on to discuss what's happening, and, just grateful.
I wanted to make one plug. I am going to be launching a podcast where I can have these types of conversations with the folks that are educating me. So I talked with Dr. Grayson. He started the racial violence syllabus after Heather Heyer murder. But I'm also talking to folks from Zin Education Project who are pushing to fight back and educate. We're working with other educators to mobilize and educate folks. So I encourage people to check me out on my socials. And also I'll be launching that podcast shortly, and it's called Just Talks. And I'm really excited to be able to do this type of thing with folks that are like on the ground, pushing back on these attacks on education justice.
I love when activists and folks who are on the ground get involved in media, because there's a whole lot of people with hot takes and who read a lot of theory, which is important. Not a lot of folks who've actually lived it and can smell things before. It's true though. I mean, it's a muscle, and when you've been an organizer and you've been on the front lines, you can smell things before maybe the general public sees them coming. So it's really important to have your voice out there. So thank you, Allison, for joining us. Good luck. I hope you run again for something else very soon. It would be really amazing. Really want to see you in office, because we need more teachers in office, and you're fierce as F. So thank you.
Thank you for your time.
Everybody, that was our Femme Friday. Thank you again for joining us. Please, if you're not already, please make sure to support us on patreon.com/The Nomiki Show. That is how we fund the show. Make sure to like and subscribe. We got to get those likes and subscribes up. Thank you to everybody who already is a patron. We love you. We so love you. And we're looking forward to doing some special stuff with you very soon. Thank you again for joining us. I hope you have a wonderful weekend. And as always, stay in solidarity. This is like really, really important right now. Stay in solidarity.
The Nomiki Show. Clash momentarily for class solidarity. Cash circulating, give the masses back its currency. Greed from elites, oligarchs stay fed. Deep state, fake fed, everybody break bread. Racism, homophobia, sexism, religion in this melting pot we live in. Time to build a new system, unionize labor rights. Highlight the issue, talking heads left is best. The saga continues. The Nomiki Show.